Hey everybody, Christian here. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about straw men and irrationality, talking a bit about these two non-theists to help illustrate some points. Part 1. Straw Men. As I mentioned in my previous vlog episode, Cameron Bertuzzi of Caption Christianity made a video called, "By the way, questions are not arguments," and Rachel Oates made a response video titled, "Christian Apologist Dislikes Socratic Method," thereby suggesting Cameron dislikes the Socratic Method, something he never said in the video, and also depicting Cameron saying don't ask questions, also something he never said in the video. Did I mention I was going to talk about straw men? Now, to be fair, I think the dialogue balloon thing is just not one of those things that's intended to be taken literally, given how I've seen it used elsewhere, like Apologia and even Cameron himself. But in my opinion, dialogue balloons shouldn't be used that way if they don't represent the speaker's actual beliefs. But maybe that's because I take things too literally sometimes. I don't know. Comment down below. I'm curious what you think. Anyway, Rachel Oates' response video had this.
But overall, I do think a lot of what he says and a lot of what he argues is problematic. I don't think a lot of what he's saying would help in an actual logical or rational debate. I think for him to just discount all questions and say, well, questions aren't arguments, is naive, it's not helpful.
And it's also what he didn't do in the video. That's a straw man. Cameron said questions aren't arguments, but he didn't discount all questions. Quite the contrary, Cameron believes some questions are really helpful. He believes honest questions can help clarify disagreements, lessen the tension, make an otherwise unproductive conversation productive again. The fact that he believes questions aren't arguments doesn't mean he believes questions are all bad. But to be fair, I think Cameron does share some blame here for not making himself absolutely 100% transparent, crystal clear on this sort of thing.
Now, to be absolutely 100% transparent, crystal clear, I'm not saying that questions are all bad. Questions are really helpful. Honest questions can help clarify disagreements, they can lessen the tension, and they can also help make a otherwise unproductive conversation productive again.
Oops. I guess Cameron did make himself clear after all, because that clip is from the very same questions are not arguments video Rachel Oates was responding to. So why did Rachel Oates go on the internet to tell lies? Actually, I'm going to defend her here. I don't think Rachel Oates lied. I think she made an honest mistake. Oh, come on. Cameron made himself pretty clear in the video she was responding to. Why do you think she wasn't lying? You know that clip I showed of Cameron not discounting all questions and instead very specifically saying that questions are really helpful? Yes. She showed that clip shortly before accusing Cameron of discounting all questions. Wait, what? How does that happen? I think she just wasn't thinking rationally here, and she's not alone. One thing that I got cut from my debate review with Canderman in vlog episode 7 was that in that debate, I stated my actual position and then Canderman strawmanned it seconds later.
So what I'm saying is, you are accepting that the world that we are fed by our senses is true, and that you're rejecting underlying metaphysical constructs like you being in a brain in a vat. I think to do the same with regard to morality, we can just see the world around us, see that people treat each other certain ways because that's what they want, and reject any underlying metaphysical principle like prescriptive moral ontology.
Well, that depends on whether it is reasonable to not accept that there's something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. In my opinion, it does not seem reasonable, but I understand this is one of those your mileage may vary sort of things.
That just seems like an appeal to consequence, where you're saying, it because I don't want it to be unreasonable.
No, that's not anything like that. It's not that I don't want it to be reasonable. It's that it does not seem reasonable to me. So here's one important point I want to bring up about irrationality, like straw men. I noticed that in emotionally charged arenas, it can be easy to assume bad things about the other side. So in the case of straw men, it might be tempting to say they're lying when you see a straw man, but it's quite possible to flagrantly misrepresent someone's position just by accident, just out of irrationality. And irrationality can rise easily in emotionally charged arenas. Hanlon's Razor says never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. For example, in April 2018, NBC Nightly News did a segment on Jordan Peterson that strawmanned him. He's not alt-right, for example. He hates white nationalism as well as other forms of racial identity politics. PSA Sitch made some largely excellent response videos I'll link to in the description below, But in this second response video, he accused NBC Nightly News of deliberate dishonesty, whereas I think NBC Nightly News just made an honest mistake.
Well, I'm not sure about that. YouTubers making flagrant straw man mistakes are one thing, but professional journalists know to be a lot more careful.
They should know, but I fear there's insufficient accountability for journalists nowadays, and that's at least part of the reason for shoddy journalism on both on the political left and on the political right.
Why do you think it's shoddy journalism, this Jordan Peterson case?
Because it's happened before. The journalist Cathy Newman interviewed Jordan Peterson, and there were times where she said, "So you're saying," followed by some straw man. There were times where she strawmanned Jordan Peterson seconds after Jordan Peterson stated his actual position. The Atlantic wrote an article about the interview titled, "Why Can't People Hear What Jordan Peterson is Saying?"
So, why can't they hear what he's saying?
I think sometimes when people have a preconceived mindset, they filter evidence accordingly, especially if they're emotionally attached to that belief. Psychology helps explain why this happens. In psychology, there's something called motivated reasoning, unconsciously processing information in a way to suit some end or goal, like believing what you want to be true. There's confirmation bias, the tendency to fit new evidence in a way that conforms to one's own views. For example, searching only for evidence that favors one's views, making an effort to avoid contrary evidence, and having a biased interpretation of evidence to favor one's views. There's also disconfirmation bias, the tendency for greater critical scrutiny of views that go against one's own, like exerting disproportionately greater effort to disconfirm views that one disbelieves. Incidentally, the existence of these biases is one reason why it's often helpful to have viewpoint diversity, like people of competing viewpoints having their disconfirmation biases checking for errors. But if, for instance, you have a politics-related discipline that's almost uniformly comprised of liberals or almost uniformly comprised of conservatives, that can get bad. I suspect that's the factor behind instances of shoddy journalism both on the left and on the right, but unfortunately it also affects academic disciplines too. Link in the description below for more on that. One bit of good news, though, is that when you're aware of these biases, you're in a better position to know to fight against them within yourself. And that's something everybody, journalists and non-journalists alike, need to do. Be aware of these biases and actively, consciously fight against them within yourself for the sake of the truth. If, for instance, you come across a claim that favors a view you really like, that's when you have to be especially careful and vigilant because of those biases. Back to Hanlon's razor. In flagrant straw man cases, it might be tempting to sue malice on the grounds that nobody's that stupid, but even smart people can be stupid in emotionally charged arenas, like religion and politics. To illustrate, take this simple math problem out of an emotionally charged context. $500 million divided by 327 million people. That's about how many dollars per person?
Well, I don't know the exact number, but I know that it's not more than a few dollars per person. That part at least seems clear.
Right. Just about any high school student worth her salt should know that much. But now watch this clip where this simple math problem is placed in a political context.
But you see it as a possibility if he wants to spend $1 billion beating this guy, he could do it.
Absolutely. Somebody tweeted recently that actually with the money he spent, he could have given every American $1 million.
I've got it. Let's put it up on the screen. When I read it tonight on social media, it kind of all became clear. Bloomberg spent $500 million on ads. U.S. population 327 million. Don't tell us if you're ahead of us on the math. He could have given each American $1 million and have had lunch money left over. It's an incredible way of putting it.
Yes. It truly is an incredible, unbelievable way of putting it.
But that's a major national news network.
Right, so you can imagine somebody watching this thinking, how does nobody catch this before it gets on the air? Well, I suspect motivated reasoning played a role. In journalism, there's a semi-humorous phrase called too good to check, which is about journalists falling prey to not sufficiently checking something because it sounds too good, like you want it to be true, and this, of course, is an example of confirmation bias, and fact-checking this tweet would have required very little effort. At any rate, this irrational mistake occurred in the emotionally charged arena of politics. And emotionally charged arenas can be breeding grounds for egregious irrationality. So while it may be tempting to think, nobody's that stupid, that is unfortunately not the world we live in, particularly when it comes to emotionally charged topics. Religion, like politics, is an emotionally charged topic, so we have to be especially careful and vigilant about not making mistakes of irrationality in such matters like straw men. Part 2. Dillahunty Debacle. An incident between Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity and prominent atheist Matt Dillahunty illustrates some important points about straw men. To help reduce the probability of someone making a straw man of your position, here are some useful tips. Tip number 1. Follow Jim Pryor's advice. Jim Pryor wrote a great article on writing philosophy papers and gave advice that's valuable not only to philosophy papers but other writing as well. I'll link to it in the description. One piece of valuable advice is to assume your reader is lazy, stupid, and mean. He's lazy in that he doesn't want to figure out what your convoluted sentences are supposed to mean, and he doesn't want to figure out what your argument is if it's not already obvious. He's stupid, so you have to explain everything you say to him in simple, bite-sized pieces, and he's mean, so he's not going to read your paper charitably. For example, if something you say admits of more than one interpretation, he's going to assume you meant the less plausible thing. Tip number 2, be clear, unambiguous, and precise. Assuming the reader is lazy, stupid, and mean helps. Tip number 3, learn to anticipate potential misunderstandings and act accordingly, like issuing disclaimers and keeping in mind 1C. A real-life example to illustrate what can go wrong if you don't follow this advice is the aforementioned incident between Cameron Bertuzzi and Matt Dillahunty. Some background first. In 2019, Christian Mike Winger debated Matt Dillahunty on the topic of Jesus' resurrection, and Winger presented various non-miraculous historical facts that he thought were evidence of the resurrection. Stuff like Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Jesus' disciples had experiences of Jesus after he died, whether those experiences were hallucinations or otherwise, and stuff like that. Agree or disagree, Winger believed that these non-miraculous historical facts constituted strong evidence for the resurrection. Part of Matt Dillahunty's rebuttal had this.
And that it was real. Okay, but that's not the evidence for the resurrection. This is what happened in your discussion with Mike.
There is no evidence for the resurrection. There are claims. And what Mike has kind of done at the start of this is to say, well, really, here's all this evidence, and it's the evidence for the supernatural, and you don't just get to throw all of it out. But it's not the evidence. It is the claim. It is a bunch of claims, and it is claims upon claims as well.
This technique was rhetorically effective to at least some degree, judging from comments like this, for example. But I think there is something that is at least potentially not quite right with this sort of response.
There's no evidence for Socrates having existed, just claims.
We do have historical evidence. Plato wrote about Socrates. So did the Greek historian Xenophon.
Plato and Xenophon made claims. Those were claims, not evidence. Come to think of it, how do we even know Plato and Xenophon wrote the works attributed to them?
Well, there weren't any video cameras or photography back then, but there were.
There were people claiming they wrote them. So it's claims upon claims. So you see, there is no evidence for Socrates. There are claims.
So I think there can be cases where this type of rebuttal is overly simplistic and reductive, not engaging the issues in a requisitely detailed and intellectually substantive way. How much this applies to the 2019 Dillahunty-Winger debate, I'll leave up to you. Link to the debate in the description. Caption Christianity made a video critiquing what Dillahunty seemed to be saying in that Dillahunty-Winger debate. Dillahunty took issue with that video, as well as Cameron not responding to this Facebook comment Dillahunty made, which Cameron thought was best to leave for people to read and think about on their own. Dillahunty apparently didn't think Cameron tried to understand what he said. In this first paragraph, Dillahunty is saying I saw X happen as both a claim and testimonial evidence, and accuses Cameron of sloppily conflating claim and evidence. But there's a problem. Those of us who went back to see the 2019 Dillahunty-Winger debate might have noticed this.
You have to evaluate the claim and then the evidence for the claim. And one of the things that Mike consistently did as he was talking was say, this is evidence, this is evidence, this is fact, this is evidence, when virtually everything that he was talking about at some level is the claim and not the evidence for it. Right up to the end where he says, oh, well, this is the evidence for the resurrection. No, these are the claims about a resurrection. The evidence for the resurrection is something else other than a whole bunch of people say it, they saw it happen, or had an experience afterward.
Now, I can understand if somebody thought something like this. Is Matt Dillahunty gaslighting us to get us to think that we didn't hear what we actually heard and that he's the one sloppily conflating claim and evidence? Or is he just outright lying to people, hoping they will look at the record to find out what he actually said? Either way, we have the video recording that exposes Matt Dillahunty's flagrant dishonesty, so... Man, that tastes great. Well, I can understand how someone could think Dillahunty was being dishonest here. As I've done before, I'll again defend the non-theists and say that I think Dillahunty made an honest mistake. The 2019 Dillahunty-Winger debate happened some 11 months prior to Cameron's video. People misremember things, and I don't think Dillahunty realized how someone who genuinely listened and tried to understand what he said in that debate might get the impression Cameron did. If Dillahunty had actually worded what he said with sufficient clarity and precision in places like those debate clips I showed, I think this whole mess could have been avoided. So if you think someone strawmanned you, maybe go back to see what you originally said. Consider the advice I gave earlier. If nothing else, you might find a better way to word what you originally said to reduce the probability of further misunderstanding. For example, in the 2019 Dillahunty and Winger debate, there are a couple of problems with Dillahunty's wording in the clips I showed. First, in at least one sense of the word claim, some claims are evidence because some claims are testimonial evidence. One might say that sense of the word claim is not the same sense Dillahunty was using, but that sense is consistent with the definition Dillahunty actually gave in the debate, because such a testimonial evidence is an assertion. If nothing else, Dillahunty's words were at least too ambiguous, if not misleading. Second, one reason why I think a those are claims not evidence response can be confusing is that you are making a claim anytime you're verbally communicating the evidence. To reiterate, anytime you're verbally communicating the evidence, you're making a claim. That verbal statement of the evidence is a claim. So responding with that's a claim, not evidence, could be like, what?
My opponent said that Plato wrote about Socrates, but Plato wrote about Socrates is not evidence. It is a sentence. My opponent offered no evidence in this debate, only sentences.
So those are problems with the wording, but what could have been done to fix this? If what Dillahunty really meant to say was, those non-miraculous alleged historical facts you're using to support your resurrection belief, I don't accept as real facts, and said it in those exact words, that would have been clearer. Good rule of thumb in writing and life in general is to actively anticipate potential problems and act accordingly. Again, consider the advice I mentioned earlier to start to lessen the straw man risk. Part 3. Learn to be skeptical of your own side. Whether you're on the right or on the left, irrationality and motivated reasoning does occur on your side. I've picked on the political left and mainstream media, but this time, for this illustration of a certain type of irrationality, I'm going to pick an example that occurred on the political right and on more independent news services. In August and September 2020, some folks on social media made this claim that only 6% of Americans who repeatedly died of COVID-19 actually died of COVID-19, a false belief that gateway pundit and the right-wing president of the United States helped spread. This was potentially dangerous misinformation because it's the sort of thing that could have made Americans more complacent about a pandemic that, at this point, had already killed more Americans than World War I. So how did this happen? I suspect what happened to MSNBC also happened to some right-wing Americans. Motivated reasoning and a too-good-to-check mentality, but it's worth looking at the specifics to see how this false claim might have originated in the first place. If you went to the appropriate CDC page at the time and found that for 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 is the only cause of death, and if you knew nothing about medicine, a couple of hypotheses might spring to mind. One is that since it seems like the goal here might be to obtain an accurate estimate of how many lives are lost to COVID-19, at least most of these not just COVID-19 deaths likely had COVID-19 as the underlying cause. Another hypothesis is that the 94% that didn't just have COVID-19 did not actually die from COVID-19 like this tweet seems to claim. Even if you want to believe it's a second hypothesis, you should fact check it with medical experts before spreading the claim. And it looks like a lot of people didn't do that. Speaking of medical experts, here's what Dr. Mike had to say. What might have happened is that this first hypothesis never even entered into some people's minds because of motivated reasoning. Another possibility is a certain double standard phenomenon I've noticed in human nature, which is a form of motivated reasoning. You see, sometimes when people don't want something to be true, they raise the standard of rational support needed to believe it, maybe to a ridiculous level where no evidence is good enough. And when they do want something to be true, they lower that standard, maybe to an absurdly low level, like in this case. As I've said before, especially when you see a claim that favors a view you really like, that's when you need to be especially careful and vigilant. Be cautious claims spread on social media. Both sides of the political aisle are susceptible to motivated reasoning. Both atheists and religious folks are susceptible to motivated reasoning. We're all susceptible and we all have to be careful. Whether you're on the left or on the right, atheist or religious, learn to be skeptical of your own side because your side does make mistakes. Part 4. Conclusion. Don't fall prey to the too-good-to-check mentality. Don't be like the folks behind this MSNBC debacle where they shared a social media claim with the world on a major news network without taking the very low effort needed to fact-check it. When you share something on social media, fact-check it before you share it. Like if you hear a person who holds a certain view, to reduce the probability of making a straw man, go straight to what that person directly said to make sure that person asserted that view. For example, if you hear that noted atheist Arden Robb believes all Caucasians should look like Genghis Khan, fact-check it before you share it. If you hear that Rachel Oates finds me interesting because of my videos and writing, fact-check it before you share it. Because if it's one thing I learned in life, it's that beautiful women have no interest in me whatsoever. Speaking of straw men, here's some advice to help avoid making straw man mistakes yourself. Number 1. Employ the principle of charity. Interpret what someone is saying in the most reasonable light that plausibly fits what they're saying, and resist the temptation to interpret that person in the worst possible way. 2. Steelman the position. A steelman is the opposite of a straw man. When critiquing an argument, think of a way to improve upon it, make it stronger, and consider attacking that steelman position in addition to attacking the person's perceived actual position. 3. Don't get the position secondhand. Go to the source and fact check. Fact checking is especially important if you're a journalist or a de facto journalist, by which I mean someone who broadcasts a claim, whether in a video or social media or whatever. Go to the source and fact check before you spread the information. Here's some advice for mitigating the risk of people strawmanning you. 1. Follow Jim Pryor's advice. Assume your reader is lazy, stupid, and mean. 2. Be clear, unambiguous, and precise. 3. Learn to anticipate potential misunderstandings and act accordingly. Advice for catching strawmen. Does the objection attack a charitable interpretation of the position? Identify the position and be charitable. Identify the objection and be charitable. Simple analysis, but I think some people don't check the actual position being attacked and try to interpret that attacked position charitably. Reminders for rational reasoning. The evidence isn't necessarily completely one-sided in favor of correct views and against incorrect views. Remembering this will hopefully help you recognize when there is evidence against a view you like, and evidence for a view you dislike, and consequently help you avoid straw men. Just because a view is correct doesn't mean the evidence is completely in favor of it, and just because the position is incorrect doesn't mean the evidence is completely one-sided against it. Bad arguments can be used for true propositions. Just because a view is correct doesn't mean every argument for it will be a good one. Just because a view is incorrect doesn't mean every objection against it will be a good one, for example fallacies. This even holds true for incorrect views you think of as crackpot or extreme. For example, I'm an evolutionist and yet I've seen a lot of bad objections to creationism, including straw men, red herrings, and bad philosophy of science. A person on the correct side of a view can get things wrong, and a person on the incorrect side of a view can get things right. Just because the person is on the correct side of a view doesn't mean they can't get things wrong pertaining to that view. Learn to be skeptical of your own side, especially if you're a journalist or a de facto journalist like when sharing a claim on social media. The flip side is that just because the person is on the incorrect side of a view doesn't mean they can't get things right pertaining to that view. Recall that just because a view is correct doesn't mean that the evidence is completely one-sided in favor of that view. Beware emotional attachments to beliefs. This often occurs in religion and politics. Emotional attachments have the potential to breed fallacies and other instances of irrationality. So when you have an emotional connection to a belief, whether for or against that belief, be especially careful about things like confirmation bias and other forms of motivated reasoning. I'm not saying emotions are always the enemy of reason, but sometimes they have a negative influence. Like I kind of mentioned before, I've noticed that sometimes when there's a belief that people dislike, they raise the standard of evidence. And when it's a belief they like, they lower the standard of evidence. It's tempting to lower the standard of evidence when it fits your side, but that's when you have to be especially careful and vigilant because of confirmation bias. Hopefully these reminders of rationality will help you be more rational and less wrong. Well, I guess that'll about wrap it up. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.